The sky will burn at 45 degrees. Fire approaches the great new city. Immediately a great flame leaps up. When they want to test the Normans. Michel de Nostradam. Welcome back to OllieKay Political. I want to begin today by transporting you to a specific moment in time, a moment that now feels akin to a vivid dream, plucked from the pages of an inexpensive paperback thriller discovered in an airport kiosk. It's a story involving spies in ill-fitting leather jackets, black market negotiations in dimly lit parking lots, briefcases full of hard currency, and the president of Poland, Lech Wałęsa. To understand the gravity of what we are discussing today, you have to mentally transport yourself to the early 1990s. The Berlin Wall has fallen, the Soviet Union is disintegrating into dust, and Poland, although technically free, is in a vulnerable state. We have no NATO membership, we have no American troops stationed on our soil. We find ourselves in a geopolitical limbo, with the unpredictable and dangerous Russian bear lurking just across the eastern border. In the corridors of power in Warsaw, amidst the cigarette smoke and the chaos of a newly birthed democracy, a radical thought began to take shape. It was a thought born of desperation. What if we just bought some insurance? There is a persistent, dark legend from those years, a story that has never been officially confirmed in full, but whose whispers have echoed through the intelligence community for 3 decades. It alleges that President Wałęsa and the newly formed State Protection Office, the UOP, grew tired of waiting for Western security guarantees that seemed like they might never come. They allegedly decided to take matters into their hands and buy nuclear warheads on the black market from the rogue elements of the dissolving Soviet army in Ukraine. Now, bear in mind, this was the wild east of the 1990s. We weren't talking about sophisticated digital transfers or encrypted blockchain ledgers. We were talking about physical cash, physical meetings, and physical warheads. The story goes that Polish intelligence set up a sting operation, ostensibly to intercept nuclear smugglers. But the whisper is that the temptation was real. The deal was supposedly set. The warheads were priced. The sellers, corrupt officers eager to profit from the empire's collapse, were ready to hand over tactical nuclear devices. The plan was distinctly Polish in its cunning. We would lure them in, verify the nukes were real, and then arrest the sellers and take the money back. It was a classic eat your cake and have it too scenario. We'd get the nukes, keep the cash, and be seen as heroes for stopping proliferation. Of course, the deal didn't go through. It turned out to likely be a Russian intelligence provocation, a KGB trap designed to frame Poland as a rogue state, a madman country that couldn't be trusted with NATO membership. If we had bought them, the headlines in the New York Times would have read, "Poland, the Iran of Europe." We would have been pariahs. But even though the operation was a sting, the very fact that it happened raises a question that has haunted Polish strategists for 30 years. What if we had succeeded? What if Poland had its own ace hidden away in a deep, reinforced silo in the Bieszczady Mountains today? Would Vladimir Putin have dared to invade Ukraine if he knew Warsaw had the capability to turn St. Petersburg into ash? Would Belarus be pushing migrants across our border with such impunity? Would we be asking Washington for more troops, or would we be in charge of Central Europe's security? Today, we are going to stop asking for permission. Today, we break the biggest taboo in European politics. We are going to talk about why Poland needs the atom. To understand why we need it, we first have to look at the country that gave it up. We need to talk about the tragedy of Ukraine. In 1991, when the Soviet Union finally dissolved, Ukraine didn't just become an independent state. It instantly became the world's third largest nuclear superpower. It inherited an arsenal that was staggering in its scale. larger than that of China, France, and the United Kingdom combined. We are talking about 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles, including the terrifying SS-19 Stiletto and the SS-24 Scalpel. They had 44 strategic heavy bombers, like the Tu-160 Blackjack and the Tu-95 Bear, capable of delivering nuclear payloads thousands of kilometers away. In total, Kiev held over 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads and roughly 3,000 tactical nuclear weapons. The result was enough firepower to turn the entire northern hemisphere into a radioactive parking lot multiple times over. It served as the ultimate safeguard. As long as Kiev held those keys, Moscow could never touch them. But then, the adults in the room showed up. The Americans and the British flew into Kiev with their suits and their smiles. They sat down with the young Ukrainian leadership and said, "This is too dangerous. You are a young democracy. You can't handle these weapons. You don't have the money to maintain them. Give them back to Russia." And what did they offer in return? They offered a piece of paper. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994. It was a beautiful ceremony. Bill Clinton smiled, Boris Yeltsin smiled, and Leonid Kuchma smiled. The document stated clearly that the USA, the UK, and Russia would guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine. They promised to never use economic or military coercion against them. It was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy, the end of history in action. In reality, it was the greatest swindle in diplomatic history. We all know how it turned out. 20 years later, in 2014, little green men appeared in Crimea. Where were the guarantors? Did the US send the 101st Airborne to push the Russians out? No. They sent blankets and MREs. 8 years later, in 2022, Russian tank columns rolled toward Kiev. Did the UK send the Royal Navy to the Black Sea? No. The Budapest Memorandum was worthless. The Budapest Memorandum was merely ink on paper, and ink cannot stop tanks. Ukraine paid for its protection with the only currency Russia respects: nuclear capability. And in exchange, they got empty promises. The lesson for Poland is brutal but simple. Security guarantees are not security. An Article 5 treaty is a promise. A nuclear warhead is a fact. Political winds can break, reinterpret, or ignore promises. Facts cannot be argued with. We must examine our map objectively and without bias. We are situated in the most promising, yet most dangerous location on the planet, the gateway between East and West. In medieval times, the threat came from both sides. The Germans pushed from the west and the Russians from the east, crushing us in the middle. Today, the situation has shifted. The West is, at least in theory, our friend. We are economically integrated with Germany. We share a border and a market. The immediate threat from the West has vanished. The real danger was, is, and will always be the East. And we need to understand the Russian mind. We often make the fatal mistake of projecting our Western liberal values onto them. We think that if we trade, be nice, de-escalate, and reset, they will be kind and cooperative. Such an assumption is a fundamental error. Russian military doctrine and their political psychology understands only one language, the language of utter power. They respect strength. They despise weakness. To the Kremlin, a country without the capacity to destroy its enemy is not a sovereign state. It is a vassal, a buffer zone, a playground for empires. Have you heard of their doctrine? Western analysts often call it escalate to de-escalate. It sounds paradoxical to the Western ear, but it makes perfect, ruthless sense. If Russia starts losing a conventional war, or if they want to freeze a conflict on their terms to prevent NATO intervention, they threaten to use a tactical nuclear weapon. They punch you in the nose so hard with a nuke that you are too scared to fight back. They bet that the West is too soft, too rich, and too comfortable to risk a global apocalypse over a city like Warsaw or Tallinn. And frankly, they might be right. The only way to stop this calculus is to change the equation entirely. Imagine a different timeline. Imagine that Poland possesses 50 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, upgraded, solid-fueled, hidden in mobile launchers deep in the Polish forests, constantly moving and impossible to track. These missiles would be aimed not at tank columns or military bases, but at the very heart of the Russian state, their decision-making centers, their bunkers, and their landmarks. In this timeline, if a Russian general suggests invading the Suwałki Gap, the answer isn't, maybe NATO will respond. The answer is, if we cross that line, Moscow and St. Petersburg cease to exist in 12 minutes. This represents a strategic advantage. Nobody in their right mind would ever endanger Poland if we held that card. It turns us from a battlefield into a player. Now, I hear the skeptical voices. But Ollie, we have the USA. We have Fort Trump. We have Biden. We have the mighty Article 5. Do we? I want you to really, deeply think about this. The United States is a global empire with global interests. They must deal with China's rise in the Pacific, Middle Eastern instability, and domestic division. If things truly escalated, if Russia threatened a full-scale nuclear exchange, do you honestly believe a president sitting in the Oval Office would sacrifice New York or Chicago? This isn't about anti-Americanism, it's about historical realism. In the 1950s, the French asked themselves the exact same question. General de Gaulle concluded that no American president would trade New York for Paris, and so France built its own force de frappe, its independent nuclear deterrent. In my view, when the chips are down, when the radiation alarms start ringing, Washington would probably give the order to withdraw. They would recoup their losses. It's not personal, it's geopolitics. Empires do not commit suicide for their provinces. The only true guarantor of your life is your gun. The only guarantor of a nation's survival is its capability. We rely on a security architecture that was built for the 1990s end-of-history euphoria. That era is over. NATO needs an upgrade, or better yet, it needs a rival. It needs a European pillar so strong it doesn't need to call Washington every time Putin sneezes. We need a European army. It is no longer a dream, it is a necessity. Poland should serve as the backbone of this European army. But a spine needs steel. In the 21st century, nuclear power serves as the backbone of military strength. So why don't we have them yet? Is it just the treaties? Is it just the Non-Proliferation Treaty? The problem is us. In the previous episode, episode 6, we talked about the Polish hell, the duopoly. The cold civil war between peace and PO/KO. This conflict is the single biggest obstacle to Poland becoming a nuclear power. Nuclear weapons require absolute internal stability. They require a political class that is mature, predictable, and capable of long-term thinking. You cannot have a nuclear arsenal in a country where the government changes every 4 years, and the new guys immediately accuse the old guys of being foreign agents, traitors, or criminals. Imagine the scenario. We get the nukes. Who holds the briefcase? Who holds the codes? If peace is in power, the opposition will scream that Jarosław Kaczynski is going to use them to start World War III just to distract from domestic inflation or judicial reforms. If the civic coalition is in power, the opposition will scream that Donald Tusk is going to give the codes to Berlin or Brussels. The lack of trust is total. I pointed this problem out before. Our politicians are too hasty. Some of them have fuses that are too short. Instead of treating the state as a sacred trust, we treat it as a partisan toy that we can break and capture. We can't entrust the duopoly with our lives. Not yet. This incident brings us back to the Swiss model I argued for in the last episode. This is why systemic change is not just about taxes or referendums. It is a matter of national survival. Until we fix our political reality, until we have a system where consensus is mandatory, where the 7-headed president, the Federal Council, governs, where no single savior holds all the power, we are too unstable to be trusted with the ultimate weapon. But what if we did fix it? If we implemented the Swiss model, stabilized our politics, and cooled down Polish hell, then the path is open. With a stable political system, a booming economy, and an ever-growing Polish army, which is already becoming the strongest land force in the EU, adding nuclear weapons would change everything. We wouldn't just be safe, we would be the security provider for the region. The Baltics, Romania, even Ukraine, they would look to Warsaw, not just Washington, for protection. We would be the guardian of the intermarium. Is this hypothetical scenario realistic? Am I just dreaming like Wałęsa did in the 90s? Technically, absolutely. Poland has nuclear research reactors like the Maria reactor. We have world-class physicists. We possess the necessary delivery systems. We are purchasing hundreds of adaptable rocket artillery systems from Korea, Chunmoo, and the US, HIMARS. We are buying F-35s, which are certified for nuclear delivery. We don't need to develop new systems. And geopolitically, the argument that if we get nukes, we become a target is invalid. We are already a target. We are already considered a foe or a potential satellite in Russian military doctrine. They already have Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad aimed at Warsaw. The only difference is that right now, we are a defenseless target. There are 2 ways to do this. Plan A is nuclear sharing. This option is the light version. Usually, when we talk about this, we imagine American B-61 bombs stored in Polish bunkers with dual keys. President Duda has already signaled we are ready for this. While this is a commendable initial step, it should be acknowledged that, in its current form, it merely represents another iteration of a complex bureaucratic document. This process entails obtaining permission, maneuvering through bureaucratic obstacles, and relying on the Americans to act decisively during a crisis. In my view, the chances of the American system functioning effectively during a crisis are at most 50%. But here is the nuance that everyone misses. The USA is not the only potential partner. We often forget that Europe has two other nuclear powers, France and the United Kingdom. Now, I can hear the cynics screaming already. Ollie, remember 1939? Remember the phony war? Do you really want to trust London and Paris again? Yes, I am painfully aware of how the UK and France fared in World War II. They promised to die for Danzig, and they didn't. But geopolitics is not static. This time, the situation is different. They know what is at stake. They know that if the Polish line breaks, the Russian tanks won't stop at the Oder. They will be parking in Berlin and threatening the Channel. Because of this existential clarity, I would rate the chances of a successful nuclear sharing agreement with London or Paris slightly higher, maybe 60-40. However, it is crucial to note that I am specifically discussing nuclear sharing, not a nuclear umbrella. An umbrella is a promise to shoot back from a submarine in the Atlantic. That is worthless to us. Sharing means the warheads are physically here, on the Vistula. And regardless of whether the partner is American, British, or French, it all comes down to one brutal psychological condition: permanent presence. Perhaps the situation would change if our allies chose to establish permanent, non-rotational bases and, crucially, invited their families to live with them here. There is a primal psychological difference between a soldier rotating through for 6 months and a soldier whose children go to school in Warsaw or Krakow. A military body that has to protect their own families will always be more motivated to fight, even to the death. Until American, British, or French families begin living in Polish suburbs, nuclear sharing remains merely a paper shield. That leaves Plan B, the independent capability. We can implement the French model in our own way. This is the hard road. It would mean leaving the Non-Proliferation Treaty, potentially facing sanctions, and enduring screaming in Berlin and Washington. But Article 10 of the NPT allows a nation to withdraw if extraordinary events jeopardize its supreme interests. A genocidal war on our border certainly counts as an extraordinary event. And frankly, I wouldn't hesitate to support acquiring these capabilities through more unorthodox means. Whether it's black market acquisition or covert development, I would be fully on board with that, and I believe most of my countrymen would be too. We are past the point of worrying about diplomatic niceties. The real issue isn't the hardware, it's the software. It's our politicians. As we discussed, the current political class is too unstable to hold the nuclear codes. The chain of command needs a total update to bypass the Polish hell. It shouldn't be left to a prime minister terrified of the next election. It should be placed in the hands of a dedicated nuclear council, a body appointed strictly by the military, comprised of free, high-ranking military officers and free civilian scientists. Professionals, specialists, people who understand the gravity of the weapon and who won't hesitate to use it if the survival of the state is at risk, but who also won't use it for political theater. If we fix the command structure, the weapon becomes a guardian, not a risk. We inhabit a world filled with formidable adversaries. We do not live in the end of history or a global village governed by international law. We live in a geopolitical jungle where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. For 300 years, Poland tried to survive by being nice, by being the best student of Europe, by making alliances and trusting the paper guarantees of distant empires. France in 1939, Britain, and now the USA. And for 300 years the result was always the same. We were partitioned, burned, occupied, and traded away at conference tables in Vienna or Yalta. It is time to stop trusting paper. Ink fades. Treaties are reinterpreted. Political will in foreign capitals evaporates when the first body bags come home. It is time to trust physics. The atom is not about war. That is a misunderstanding of its purpose. The atom is about peace. It is about the unwavering, unyielding peace that arises from the understanding that if anyone, be it a revisionist empire to the east or a chaotic force to the south, touches you, the consequences will not be diplomatic condemnation or sanctions, but rather they will face infinite destruction. We have the economy to sustain it. We have the army to protect it. We have the geography that demands it. Now we just need the political maturity, the Swiss model, the nuclear council, the end of the Polish hell to handle the responsibility. It's not a dream anymore. It is a necessity. The era of improvising our survival is over. Let's stop trying to buy briefcases in parking lots like it's a bad 1992 spy thriller. Let's stop looking for shortcuts and start building the future like it's 2030. Systematic, sovereign, and undeniable. And what are we going to discuss in the next episode? We've talked about maps, we've talked about bombs, and we've talked about politics. But next time, we need to talk about the software that runs it all. We are going to talk about the virtues and vices of Poles as a nation, from the historical, social, and geopolitical points of view. We will reflect on our own identity. Join me for I, Pole. Thank you for reading Episode 7. This series is about waking up from a 3-decade geopolitical nap. And let me tell you, nothing wakes you up faster than the sound of a Geiger counter. If you agree that Poland needs to print its security, if you believe we should be a player and not a playground, share this content. Send it to your friends. Send it to your skeptics. Force the conversation. I'm OllieKay. Stay safe, stay radioactive, and I'll see you in the next one.